just a couple of things. We will have we'll show you a 1099 miscellaneous and NEC. The 2021 version was modified slightly. They did redesign, as everybody is aware. The 1099 did a whole new design in 2020, but for the 2021, they actually changed the name. It no longer says miscellaneous income, it says miscellaneous information, so that everybody's aware. It's not, you're just reporting the information to the IRS. And then they created box 11, was blank in the previous year. This year, they put something in there. And then for the NEC, which started in 2020, they did a slight adjustment to that as well. They made it smaller, and they have another new box as well, box 2. And we will see that in a moment. Just a couple reminders as to what items go in what boxes. This is just a general overview of what items are in each of the boxes for the 1099 miscellaneous and then the 1099 NEC. And we will go into a little bit more detail of these further on in the presentation. But I thought I'd just share this with you. Here's the new 1099 miscellaneous for 2021, the one that you will be preparing in January of 2022. And as you can see, they have changed the miscellaneous income to say miscellaneous information. So that way people realize that this is truly informational form. There is no tax that you pay on this, but the recipient has to include that income in their tax filings. And then they also down here added box 11. This used to be blocked out, but they've now made it a box for fish purchased for resale. Then let's go through the boxes that we have. So box 1 is for rents. Again, this is for all types of rents for merchandise, for space, but you wouldn't pay it to a real estate agent. You would pay it, there's certain types of real estate that you would pay. Like if you're paying rent for an office space, if it's a corporation, then you would not issue them a 1099. But if it is for office space that's to an LLC or a partnership, you would. Also, a lot of times people don't realize that rent of machinery is also a 1099 item. Now, the issue with the machinery could be that you have the rental of the piece of equipment in box 1, but what about the operator? That you'd have to break out, and that would not go into the 1099 miscellaneous. You'd have to issue a 1099 NEC potentially for that operator's income or payment that you made to them. So that could be something that you have to break out. Then there's box 2 for royalties. This is tangible items, copyrights, patents, trademarks for $10 or more. This is the only one on the 1099 miscellaneous that when you're reporting something, a payment to a vendor, that it's not $600. Box 3 is the other income. This is typically when I say it is, if you can't find something where it needs to go in one of the other boxes, it probably goes in box 3. This is the all-encompassing one where if it doesn't fit into something else, it might go into box 3, but you have to make sure that it isn't subject to self-employment tax, because otherwise, if it is subject to self-employment tax, then you would want to make sure you put it on a 1099 NEC. But the items that typically go into the box 3 are your prizes and awards, punitive damages, insurance for salesperson. These are types of items that go into this box. What can be when it says prizes and awards for services not performed, this could be just not a raffle, but if you won a lawnmower at a church auction, it's kind of a bad item, but if you won something, but you're not an employee, you were gifted something, you weren't gifted, you won that lawnmower and they had to report the income to you, it would go to this 1099 miscellaneous box 3. Box 4 is for federal income tax withholding. Now, if you put, this also doesn't have a dollar limit. If you have to withhold $10, you need to issue a 1099 to that recipient. So there is no dollar limit or minimum for this box, but if you have to withhold any specific dollar amount, you would include that on a 1099 and issue a 1099 to that recipient. And when do you do withholding? That is if they don't issue you a completed W-9 form, you don't have the federal identification number of that vendor, you've requested it, the IRS has requested that you request it, you then have to start withholding from that vendor on any of the next payments, and then you submit it with your 945 at the end of the year. So there are some specific rules for this, that if the vendor does not give you their 1099, their W-9, the I-9 form, the EIN, you then would start back up withholding. And again, this is for any dollar amount. Box 5 is fishing boat proceeds. I haven't seen this too often used around here, but this would be if you had like a crew member, you're paying somebody's a crew and it's more than $100. But again, we don't typically see that box filled in around here. But box 6 can be used sometimes. This is one of the exceptions for submitting to a corporation. Box 6 is for medical or healthcare payments of $600 or more. Again, this is in your trade or business. The one that I run across frequently is when organizations pay for drug testing, or they pay for somebody's medical expenses, one of their employees, they have that self-insured medical plan, they're paying to another organization for those services and products, then you would issue a 1099 miscellaneous with box 6. And you would include it even if it's a corporation. But if it's a tax exempt organization, you would not. That is one of the exceptions we'll go through. But this is not if the, for any payments for a flexible spending account or an HRA. Again, this is if you are paying for drug testing, is typically what I see in this box. Then we have box 7, which is a checkbox. This is if there's direct sales of $5,000 or more, not in a permanent establishment. So this wouldn't be for sales in a retail establishment like a JCPenney's, but this would be more in a trade show arena, or something that is a vendors on a marketplace type of, where that you have those farmers market types of organizations, and there's $5,000 or more, and it's on a buy sell type of transaction. There's a checkbox on the 1099 miscellaneous, but there is also a checkbox on the 1099 NEC. They added that this year as well, because if you have that commissions, then you would put it on the NEC and you'd check that box. But you might have in the on the occasion where you need to report the 1099 miscellaneous and check this box, but it's considered other income, not subject to self-employment tax. So that's why they have it on both boxes. Also, you could potentially check the box on the 1099 miscellaneous and then provide the recipient a listing separate than the dollar amount on the 1099 miscellaneous. So there's multiple ways to do that. Box 8, substitute payments in lieu of dividends or interest. This would be again in the trade or business. So typically we don't see this one. Crop insurance proceeds, I typically don't see this one either. That's box 9. Box 10, this one has been confusing because this is gross proceeds paid to an attorney. This is not when you pay an attorney for their services. So if you pay an attorney $700 to do your incorporation documents, that doesn't go in box 10. That actually goes on the 1099-NEC. What goes in box 10 would be the proceeds from a settlement. That would go into box 10. And in some cases, you would issue one to the attorney, and typically it's the insurance organization that issues it to the attorney because they're paying the settlement. And then they may end up also issuing one to the recipient that received the funds. So there are some specific rules there, but we're not going to get into all the details for that. But again, remember, these are all in your trade or business setting and more than $600. 1099 miscellaneous continued. The new box is box 11, fish purchased for resale. So you paid more than $600, again, in your trade or business to somebody engaged in catching fish. So there again, this would be cash. It wouldn't be a credit card. The one thing that is mentioned on this one says, remember, this one says not check though. So it's got to be purely cash. Then 12 is 409A deferrals, 13 golden parachute payments, 14 non-qualified compensation. The box 15 through 17 are important designations because these are the state information, the state ID number, the state 2-digit code, and then, which is, you know, if it's Wisconsin, it's WI, it's just their abbreviations, the ID number, and then the dollar amount. You have possibly withholding. But what happens is you have to remember where the service was performed is what state gets the information completed in this box. So if the service was not performed in the state of Wisconsin and the recipient is not a Wisconsin resident, you do not want to issue a 1099 to the state of Wisconsin for that vendor. If the vendor is a Wisconsin resident, then you would still issue the 1099 to that vendor. But again, if the service is not performed in the state of Wisconsin, it has to be a Wisconsin connection for Wisconsin to receive a 1099. Now, if you had Wisconsin withholding, you would issue a 1099 no matter what. So what we have here, oops, what we have here is multiple states 1099, and you can see that we have Wisconsin listed here. See, 15 is the state tax withheld, 16 is the state payer's number, so Wisconsin, and then they have no withholding number, so we use the lovely long number. And the income for the state of Wisconsin was $3,500. New York had 3,500. New York had 2,000 to equal the number in box 3 for other income for John Smith. So you can have multiple states. You have to make sure you determine which ones you should have. And then, as I mentioned, here is box 11 for the new box. Otherwise, they have not changed the form, and it now says miscellaneous information instead of miscellaneous income. Now, for the 1099 NEC, they did remove a large amount of the space that they had in the form, so they made it shorter. And they say they did that so that you could fit 3 on a page when you're printing them out versus having 2 on a page for the normal 1099 size, because there isn't as much information on an NEC as there is on the normal 1099 miscellaneous. And so they did make some of the items smaller. They did also remove the box for the FATCA, and they have just the second TIN notification box, which we'll talk about in a minute. But then this box 2, payer made direct sales totaling 5,000 or more. Here again, they have the checkbox here, like they do on the miscellaneous, so that you can then check the box and put a dollar amount in box 1 as necessary. Otherwise, they did not change any of the other boxes for the 2021. And as I mentioned, you know, this is for the non-employee compensation for, you know, when you're issuing it to a partnership, an LLC, a sole proprietor that's a cleaning person. Those are the items that typically you do see on a 1099 NEC. And we have them listed here, as you can read, but you have to remember that within these items, that if you have parts and materials that are incidental to the service, you do need to include that as the total amount. For example, if you have architectural fees that you're paying, that architectural drawing is incidental to the actual service that the architect is giving you. So therefore, you have the fees included. Sometimes people ask me, well, okay, but this consultant I used, or this person who's doing the painting for me, I paid them for the painting as well as their service of paint, their actual service of painting the room. Well, it's all one item. You don't separate it out and say, well, the paint was $500 and your service was $600. You just lump it all together, because to that person, they purchased the paint, so that is an expense for them. You're reporting, remember, you're just reporting this income, this information to the IRS, so that recipient picks up the $1,100 as income, and then they pick up their charge for their expense of the paint, whatever it was, $300 or $400. And so they do come to the net revenue. If you were only report the $500 or $600 that you gave them for painting, well, then they're going to report the $600 of painting, and then they're going to report their expense of buying the paint. So you're actually not coming to the same net number that they should be coming to. You're kind of underreporting it then. There's also, you have to remember, if there's any fee splitting or referral fees, that would go on this 1099 NEC as well. Again, barter transactions, if you're bartering with an attorney, they're settling your, doing some work for you as far as some bad debt work, and you're doing something for them. It's the fair market value of the fee for the services that are transpired that need to be issued on that 1099. Now, if it's not in your trade or business, whereas you're asking the attorney to do something on a divorce for you, that's not in your trade or business, but you may be doing something for them as far as professional in a trade or business. So you have to look at what is transpiring and who needs to be issued the 1099, because it's all has to be just, again, in the trade or business. Items that do not go on a 1099. Again, an employee gets a W-2, not a 1099. There is an instance when an employee would get a 1099 if they are doing something that is not in their personnel, their job description, if you would. So they are doing something that they do for other people, maybe on the side. They're doing advertising for your company, but their job description is a data clerk. But they're also doing that advertising for you, then they would potentially you'd give them a 1099 because that's not in their job description. And they're doing that also for other individuals. But typically an employee gets a W-2 for reimbursement of employee expenses and everything. And so then we're just briefly gonna show you, you have to decide, are they an employee or are they an independent contractor? Because if they're an employee, you should be issuing them a W-2. If they're an independent contractor, a 1099-NEC. So you have to make sure who has the control of the employee. It's getting a little bit more gray area because so many people are working from home. So you can't really use potentially where they're working, but what they're using, who has control over what they do, the timing they do it as. That's how you have to look at it. It's not always a black and white type of distinction. But it all has to do with control. It doesn't have to do with, you know, a whole other items. But here's something, you know, are there set hours? Who's giving them training? Are they paying for training? Are they taking on any risk if they don't complete this task? Is the risk on them that they hired somebody else to do the task for them? Or if they're doing the task, are you know, what's the end result? So you have to look at all the items that are, all the questions that are involved to determine who is an employee and who's an independent contractor. The IRS is looking at this more and more, and you have to determine and go and continue on with that. Now, the issue can be if you have one person doing one type of task, you have to make sure that everybody doing that same thing is treated the same way. They're all employees or they're all independent contractors if they're doing the same thing. But each different task can have different designations. You could have independent contractors and employees, but you have to look at what they're doing, where they're doing it, how they're doing it, and with what utility, what items are they doing it? Are you providing the tools? Are you providing the hours, or the place that they can do it at? Those are the questions that have to be asked. And then you have to document it. And then I would suggest if they are an independent contractor, they invoice you, they provide a business card, you keep that in the file with all the information so that you have that backup information. There is some classification that came out a few years ago, whereas if you were treating somebody as an independent contractor and you needed to treat them as an employee, you could then go back and change that going forward. The IRS has set up some rules where you would then apply for forgiveness, if you would. They wouldn't penalize you. You would just pay 10% of the liability for the last 3 years, and you would then switch them to employees moving forward. So there are some rules on that that can get complicated, but it is if you realize that you should have somebody treated as an employee that you have been treating as an independent contractor. And there are specific rules and requirements. You can't be under audit to do this. But then you also open yourself up to a longer, they had a longer extension period where you would be able to, you were under audit for 7 years possibly, but now they've eliminated that. So then after you've completed box 1, there are like I said, box 2 is new this year. So that is your direct sales checkbox. But then box 4 is the withholding, the federal withholding amounts. And again, it can be any dollar amount. And then box 5, 6, and 7 are the state information. And the same thing goes for the NEC as goes for the 1099 miscellaneous. Where is the service performed? That is the key to completing those boxes on the bottom. Then the few other boxes that are worth mentioning are the account number. This is used only if you're issuing a 1099 miscellaneous or a 1099 NEC to multiple vendors. You're issuing multiple 1099s or any miscellaneouses or NECs to one vendor. So they're getting 2 or 3 of them for different reasons. You might want to put something in that designation into that accounts box so that if you do get an IRS notice, you know which box or which 1099 it relates to. That's all this is for, is just to have something there to designate which 1099 it is. A telephone number, on the other hand, is required. Most people put it within the address box of the payor so that, you know, I'm issuing a 1099 to Joe Smith. I'm going to include my name, address, and telephone number and contact information so that if Joe Smith has questions, he knows who to contact. That's what that's for. And then the FATCA filing box is if you're a foreign financial institution reporting. And so if you just have US funds transferring and everything, you would not need to mark this box. Now, the second TIN notice box. This box is if you have received communication from the IRS for multiple years on one vendor. You're having issues getting the EIN correct. There's some matching issues with the IRS, and they've sent you multiple notices on this one vendor. You can mark this box and they won't send you any future notices for this particular vendor. You can't mark it for all of your 1099s, but if you've received multiple notices on this. Now, recipients that do not receive 1099s are corporations, government entities, and not-for-profit tax-exempt organizations. But as you can see under corporations, there are exceptions to the rules. Obviously, if you have federal withholding for a corporation, you would issue them a 1099 anyway. But then also medical health care payments, you can see the list. There are, you know, attorneys always get issued a 1099. As long as it's more than $600, you're going to issue one to an attorney, whether it's an NEC or a miscellaneous. And then just a little brief on the recipients. What we have is that you want to make sure you're sending the 1099 and you're listing the vendor as proper so that it matches the IRS records to avoid those notices. So if you have a sole proprietor or an individual, you want to make sure that you're using the sole proprietor individual's name and their social security number. You do not want to list it as Smith Landscaping LLC if Joe Smith is the person that is the vendor. Even though they're running their business as Smith Landscaping LLC, they are an individual, and it gets difficult, but you have to get that information, because otherwise what happens is it's not going to match the IRS records, because Smith Landscaping LLC does not file any partnership returns. Joe Smith files an individual return and you may receive a notice. not necessarily from the IRS if Smith Landscaping LLC has employees and they have an EIN, but you will receive one from Wisconsin because Smith Landscaping LLC doesn't exist as a individual filing. So you can see how John Smith, doing business as Smith Landscaping, we would then want to make sure we have their social security number, and you want to make sure you do it as a social security number and the name matches the social security number for that purpose. So you do avoid notices. Now, an LLC is going to be that Smith Landscaping LLC. How do I know? Is it a partnership? Is it an LLC, single member? Who do I complete this 1099 for? That gets very confusing, but we'll kind of the W-9, which we'll see, which is what you need from everybody, is the factor as to how to make this less confusing. And the question to the vendor is, how do you file your return? Do you file a partnership? Do you file a 1040 individual filing? Do you file a corporate return? Because some LLCs do file as a C Corp or an S Corp. And so that's the information you have to find out, because if the LLC files as an individual 1040, you would need their social security number and their name. If they file as a partnership or an S Corp, you would need the business name and EIN. So here we have an example, Jane Jones Bookkeeping LLC. Again, we use Jane Jones and her social security number because she files as a single member LLC 1040. But if Jane Jones was a partnership, you would then have ABC LLC, and you see that it's now as the 9-digit EIN with the 2 digits first and then the rest of the 7 afterwards. And if we have a corporation, because we have attorneys, here we go again, you just have the name and the ID number. There are some, and we're gonna just kind of go over them, but you could have some middleman nominee 1099s where you receive a 1099 and you need to issue it to somebody else, or part of it to somebody else. There are specific rules on that. Also, if you purchase an organization, another company, there are rules on being a successor organization. How do you complete those 1099s? You can include them all for the whole year, or sometimes you only include the ones that the vendors that you've had for the time that you purchased the company. There are specific requirements that need to be met, but there are rules as to who completes the 1099s and when do they get completed as well. Now, as I mentioned, 1099s, the ID number is very, very significant, and we need to make sure we have it the proper format. So we need to make sure if it's a social security number, an EIN, how does it get listed? Do you have to make, can you list it as the 2 digits and then the 7, or the 3, 2, and 4? Now, you can truncate the taxpayer identification number only on the recipient copy. This started a couple of years ago, and I think most softwares do it automatically, but the one to the IRS or to the state needs to have all 9 digits showing. And you want to make sure that you request properly the W-9 from the recipients timely so that you have the information to complete everything. And what you need to do is read this box carefully when completing a W-9 or when you receive a W-9. If you have somebody that is giving you a box that is marked here as individual sole proprietor, then they need to have a social security number. If they have an employer ID number, that's not going to work for the state of Wisconsin. Now, if they have marked limited liability company here, and this is kind of grayed out, I need to change it slightly, but the options here are to mark a C corporation, S corporation, or partnership. It is how they file their federal return. If they mark this box that they're a limited liability company and they mark it as a C or an S corporation, you do not need to issue them a 1099. If they mark it as a P for partnership, you would need to issue them a 1099, and they should have an ID number here. But if they mark this as a limited liability company, but they do not put something here because they don't file as a C or an S or a partnership, again, they need to have this box marked because they're probably filing as a 1040. So that's where the confusion tends to lie. Now, you need to make sure you get the W-9 completed. It does not need to be signed. It gives you the information to complete the 1099, but there is also rules and regulations. If they don't issue you a 1099 or a completed W-9, there are some penalties that they could be subject to for not completing it. So you want to make sure you get that W-9 form, because you could also be penalized if you're not completing the proper 1099s. But to make sure that the IRS has, that you're matching the IRS documentation, there is this program, a TIN matching program that you can look into to make sure that you match what you're entering on the W-1099 matches what the IRS is, to avoid those penalties. There's some setup information, as long as you just go to the IRS and put in the search engine TIN matching, this should come up. And you want to make sure that you, it's a registration process, and you'll have to go through, but it then gives you the information. As long as you put in a social security or an EIN number and a name, it will then tell you if it matches or not. It will not give you the EIN number, but it will tell you if it matches. Now, we do know that the 1099-NEC is due January 31st to the recipients and to the IRS. This was changed a few years ago when everything was due to the IRS by February 28th. But the 1099 miscellaneous is now due to the recipient January 31st, but to the IRS by February 28th. So you can see, whereas previously when you had just one form, one information form, you had to make sure you had the non-employee ones completed by January 31st. Now you have two separate forms. One is due January 31st to the IRS. One is due February 28th to the IRS. Unless, of course, you file your 1099 miscellaneous electronically, they're due the 31st to the IRS. But the NEC, whether you electronically file it or paper file it to the IRS, is due January 31st. And there are some exceptions to the 1099 miscellaneous when you have these couple boxes. Wisconsin requires a 1099 NEC and miscellaneous when you have withholding, when you have a connection to the state of Wisconsin. If there is no connection to the state of Wisconsin, you do not need to issue that one to the state of Wisconsin. There are rules for all the other states as well, whether they're required or not. You can request an extension for the 1099 miscellaneous, but you cannot request an extension for the 1099 NEC. Now, if you have to, how do you file these? Well, as I mentioned, you can electronically submit them to the IRS and to Wisconsin. The rule is you're required to submit them electronically. If you have 250 or more, they are looking at reducing that number, and it was supposed to come out that they were going to reduce it to 100 starting with this coming filing year, but they have moved that back And I have not seen anything as of yet as to that filing requirement. But you can file them electronically through the FIRE system with the IRS. There is no place on the IRS website to just type them in and submit them. You can for W-2s under the Social Security Administration, but not 1099s. And in order to register for this FIRE system, you need a 30 to 60 days to get approval and have some testing. There are some different ways you can e-file by third-party vendors and things as well. But I do want to mention that even though the IRS has that $250 recipient rule, Wisconsin has a shorter rule, a smaller rule, that if it's under 10, so that means if you file 9 1099s, you need to electronically file them. So, and it's just of one kind. So if you could have 9 1099 miscellaneouses and 8 1099 NECs, you still can paper file them. It's when you have that 10th of one type of form. And again, the reminder is that it has to be a Wisconsin connection or withholding. You can also type these in under the My Tax account in Wisconsin if you want to paper file them for the IRS, but then type them in for Wisconsin. Or you can use the combined filing federal state filing program as well, or any other IRS formatted file you can submit to Wisconsin. Now, if you need to paper file, I'm providing the addresses for paper filing as well. And then there is only if you paper file, there is a 1096 that needs to be required. And that is a subtotal form that is issued to the IRS when you paper file only. When you electronically submit the 1099s, it has its own subtotal package. And so this is a 1096, just so that you have a copy of what it looks like. Now, there are some rules. If you have some incorrect filings, you want to make sure that you contact the IRS. If the payer name is incorrect, but not the recipient, there's a different filing format for that. If you've had duplicate reportings as well, you want to contact them here as well. Or there's a phone number as well. But we have to sometimes correct, and we'll just show you 1099 miscellaneous. You sometimes want to just correct the 1099. And so those are the boxes on the top where you correct it, not void it. Void is for when you want them to not read that 1099. And then there are penalties if you don't complete them properly. So I'll just show those for you. And most of that is for, again, some missing information you want to make sure you get. What I do want to make sure everybody is aware of is that you need to keep these documents for at least 4 years, because the IRS can come back and they say 6 years they could contact the taxpayer if you fail to report the income. So I would actually keep it for longer. And then one thing to note is when you're sending these, if you're mailing them to the recipients, don't put official tax document enclosed on the outside. That is kind of an easy target for thieves, and then they will take those. They don't care about federal fraud, but one thing you can do is that, as I mentioned before, is if you X out the first 5 digits of the Social Security number or EIN, then they only have the last 4. Or you can send them electronically. You just have to make sure that you get proof that you're sending it to the right email address and that the recipient has availability to get a paper document if they want.